My kind and gentle father-in-law, after a long illness, passed away. The funeral of my father-in-law, who had many friends, was attended by not only relatives but also many from his work, making it a grand ceremony. I hope to be sent off like this too, surrounded by family and many acquaintances. I'll pick out some BGM, so count on you to handle it. My husband, as the chief mourner, told me this in his usual manner, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. For me, it was a case of who are you to say that? Ask your real family for that. After all, we're just a family for show, right? I don't owe you that much. I declared that I knew all my husband's secrets and showed just a bit of evidence. Then, my husband turned pale and freaked out. Everything Dad left behind will be inherited by me, his son. The truth became widely known, and with these words, spoken in a panic, my husband was about to face even greater hell. I began living with my in-laws shortly after getting married. I was hesitant about moving in with my in-laws before the marriage, but it wouldn't be true to say I didn't consider it. However, my in-laws were very kind, and my husband assured me he'd always be on my side no matter what. Encouraged by the kindness of my in-laws and my husband's strong words, I decided to move in with them. After the marriage, I continued working for a while but decided to quit just before turning 30. Become a full-time housewife. The decision to resign was driven by my desire to have children and the gradual decline in my father-in-law's physical strength. My father-in-law, who said it was too early for retirement, kept working, but he started spending more time at home on his days off, going out less than before. My mother-in-law had been urging my father-in-law to go to the hospital, but he insisted it was just the natural decrease in energy that comes with age and refused to see a doctor. Eventually, it became clear that I was pregnant. My father-in-law, who was looking forward to the birth of a grandchild, seemed to regain some energy when he found out about my pregnancy. When our son was born safely, my father-in-law, holding him and squinting happily, looked very content. Our family's bond strengthened, and we deeply felt our happiness. About a year after my son's birth, my husband was transferred to a different department at work. His job responsibilities seemed to change, resulting in more overtime. He started coming home on the last train for half the week. I doubted the sense in working overtime under such circumstances. My father-in-law and I were worried about this. Meanwhile, my husband started staying out overnight, claiming it was for business trips. He was returning home late on weekdays, even at the start of the week. Gradually, he began to go out alone more frequently on weekends and holidays, finding various excuses. I tolerated his work commitments on weekdays. When I was working, there were times when I had to do overtime to finish my work. I understand that this happens when you have a job. But I wondered what kind of work required him to be so busy that he had to give up his weekends. I was extremely worried about my husband's health. Seemingly annoyed that I would interfere whenever he mentioned work or social commitments, my husband's reasons for going out became more and more vague. Hey, who calls a family man out on his day off? If it's someone from work, they must know you have a young child, right? We had received baby gifts from my husband's colleagues and superiors. Knowing that even his direct boss had given us a gift, I couldn't believe that they would be so hard on him. In such an environment, I really wanted to speak out against his company or boss who would do the opposite. Don't interfere with my work. I don't want to interfere with your work either. But can't you act a bit more like a father? I'm earning money as a father, aren't I? What more do you want from me? And so, our arguments always turn out like this. My mother-in-law also tried to stop my husband's frequent outings, warning him that he'll become a stranger rather than a father to our child, but it was to no avail. First of all, you're a terrible wife, which is why I never find peace of mind. He started to dictate how a wife should be, waiting up for her husband, not eating before him. Once our child grows a bit more, I could adapt my schedule to his, staying up late or having meals together. But right now, with a young child, our life inevitably revolves around the child's needs. And my mother-in-law strongly opposed him on this. Basically, you lack feminine charm. Before being a mother, you are my wife and a woman. Women who abandon their femininity after marriage are just like you. I'm unlucky to have a wife like that. How can one expect to be well-dressed while managing household chores and childcare? If you want me to look beautiful, help with the childcare. If I had time to put on makeup, I'd rather lie down a bit. And I can't leisurely shop for new clothes when I have to take the child with me. Without my husband's cooperation, it's impossible to maintain the role of his wife. His unhelpful and demanding attitude led me to suspect him of infidelity. There were several reasons for my suspicion. It might sound like I'm overly influenced by dramas or stories from cheated wives, but the frequent business trips, weekend work, and calls to go out were suspicious. The extremely limited time he spent at home and the frequent outings under the pretext of work. Going out after mentioning names of superiors or subordinates, claiming they called him out. No traces of excessive credit card use, but hints of women's perfume and cosmetics, and his attitude of not questioning him since he provides for the household, were concerning. It sounded like someone had advised him that as long as he provides financially, he won't get caught. Around this time, my father-in-law's previously diagnosed illness worsened. After my mother-in-law's persuasion, he finally agreed to undergo tests at the hospital, but his condition was incurable and required lifelong management. He had already retired and was living a restricted life while taking medication to slow the progression of his disease. My father-in-law had already retired from his job, and it was my husband's income that supported our family's finances. Maybe that's why my husband's attitude got louder and things got tighter. Even with 2 women in the house, there were limits to supporting my father-in-law. He decided to be hospitalized to avoid any sudden worsening, considering the strain on my mother-in-law and me. Visiting the hospital was quite challenging. There was no nearby hospital specialized in my father-in-law's condition, so we had to travel about 30 minutes by car to a larger hospital. Neither my mother-in-law nor I could drive, so we had to rely on taxis or public transportation. There were times when I wished my husband would help with transportation, as it would have made things much easier. Visiting the hospital? Carrying stuff? It's not necessary. He's just exaggerating a simple hospital checkup. My husband dismissed my father-in-law's hospitalization as just a checkup and never visited him. Even when I asked him just to drive us nearby, he wouldn't help, claiming my mother-in-law and I were overreacting. Time just passed by. My father-in-law, growing increasingly weak, passed away despite our desperate care. A few days before my father-in-law passed away, my husband was out of town on what he said was a long business trip. The doctor had already told him that he would have to wait 2 days at the most. "Why does your company make you work even at such a time?" I yelled at him, which was rare for me. But he just retorted, "Who do you think you're eating off?" and left. My mother-in-law had hurt her back caring for my father-in-law, so we had to stay in a nearby hotel to be close to the hospital. There was no time to immerse ourselves in grief over my father-in-law's passing, as we were busy arranging the funeral. My father-in-law was a person of great character. Despite having retired, many of his former colleagues and subordinates attended the funeral. Many even volunteered to help, which was a great relief to my mother-in-law and me. No relatives spoke ill of my father-in-law, instead, they shared tearful memories of him. The funeral for his father-in-law was a peaceful time to say goodbye. It was a very heartwarming funeral. However, my husband's behavior as the chief mourner during the post-funeral meal ruined the serene aftermath. "Hey, bring more drinks. The meal at this table is almost gone. You're the wife, so act more hospitably." We had entrusted everything to the catering service, anticipating a large turnout. If you tell the staff, they can add drinks and food. Yet, my husband would not tell the staff directly, but would order it from me first. Furthermore, he insulted me in front of distant relatives and my father-in-law's business contacts who couldn't visit him during his illness. He said things like, "Sorry for my useless wife. She's just like this at home too," and "She left my father's care to my mother and the hospital, just lazing around at home, the worst wife." I was irritated and thought, "That's exactly like you," but I didn't want to stoop to his level and be seen as the same as him. I held back my anger and said, "I apologize for any shortcomings. Please let me know if there's anything I can do." But it was when my mother-in-law suggested it was time to wrap up the gathering. Almost everyone stayed till the end to mourn my father-in-law. Seeing this, my husband muttered, "I want to be sent off by my family like this too." He might not have been aware that he said it out loud, but I heard it clearly and thought, "The nerve of you to say that." I had reached my limit of patience. "You should ask your other family to fulfill that wish, since I can't." When my husband looked confused, I clarified, "About wanting a funeral like your father's, being sent off by family." Realizing he had spoken his thoughts aloud, he started to make excuses in a flustered manner. "I'm a good husband, right? We're not struggling financially, and our future is secure. What's wrong with talking about my ideal funeral? However, the remaining family members asked, what other family, looking back and forth between my husband and me. At this point, my husband finally realized that he was in a terrible situation. My husband's eyes swim as sweat beads on his forehead. Another family? No, I want to know about that too. Maybe my dad had a secret child? In response to my husband's attitude that seemed to cut him off from the truth, I pulled out one of the documents that my father-in-law had given me and turned it over to him. When my husband saw it, his face turned pale. It was like watching the blood drain from his face. It turned out I wasn't the only one suspecting my husband's infidelity. I only suspected but did not take any action. It is more correct to say that I wanted to, but could not. As a housewife, I had limited money at my disposal, and it was impossible for me to take my son to a credit agency and follow my husband. However, my father-in-law paid for the investigation out of his own savings. And this was before I realized that my husband was cheating on me. My father-in-law had asked me to come alone at the end of the investigation, wanting to give it to him while he was still conscious. The documents he handed me at that time were the many proofs of my husband's affair. He passed away within a week of handing them to me. My father-in-law had also introduced me to a lawyer, a friend of his, in case I ever ran into trouble. I had already discussed this with my mother-in-law the day I received the infidelity documents from my father-in-law. The answer we came up with was to cut my husband loose after all of my father-in-law's funeral-related matters were over. We felt that we could not make a normal decision until there was a break, and that this was a matter between us and our parents, and that it was not right to involve our relatives. But seeing my husband relentlessly following his own path without any regard for us, I realized there was no need to be considerate anymore. While the relatives were still around, I decided to blatantly expose my husband's infidelity. Don't think you can get away with just a simple affair. I scattered not just the paper with evidence of his infidelity but also photos of them being affectionate, entering a motel, on vacation together. There's a child between you and your mistress, right? When is the due date? It turned out to be around the time my father-in-law decided to be hospitalized. While my mother-in-law and I were caring for my father-in-law, my husband was busy getting his mistress pregnant. My mother-in-law was so furious that her veins were bursting. I was worried that her blood pressure would rise so high that she would collapse. While some relatives tried to calm her, others condemned my husband as a disgrace to the family. Not a single person sided with my husband as he tried to come up with excuses to get through the situation. It was just some fun with a lady from a bar. That excuse might have passed for travel and hotel stays, albeit weekly. However, it is a very bitter excuse. Some relatives, who were familiar with the bar business, pointed out that getting a woman pregnant goes beyond work-related interactions, leaving my husband speechless. Even if it was within the context of a bar, as a married man, it's a matter of courtesy to refuse intimate companionship, they argued harshly. My husband might have thought the male relatives would empathize with him. But none of them shared his view, showing disgust instead. Finally, my husband became defiant. I was planning to keep it hidden until I got my father's inheritance, but since it's out, there's no need to hide it anymore. He planned to divorce me after the inheritance was settled and remarry his mistress. He will start a new life with a new family. All of this is your fault, you worthless wife. Dad probably favored you because you seduced him behind the scenes. Compared to Mom, any woman like you would seem better. Hearing this, my mother-in-law exclaimed, "How dare you say such things, you good-for-nothing," and burst into tears. My father-in-law had always been kind and considerate to me because I lost my own father at a young age. I once confided in him that I did not know what it was like to be a father. At that time, my mother-in-law was also present, and we were talking about how I could consider my father-in-law as my biological father. I cherished my in-laws like my real parents, sometimes even behaving affectionately. They had always wanted a daughter, so they treated me not just as a daughter-in-law but as their own daughter. That was all it was. How dare he equate my in-laws' affection with something romantic? I felt nauseous at my husband's corrupted thinking, instantly connecting any interaction with the opposite sex to romance. Amidst this chaos, a man stepped in. It was the lawyer my father-in-law had introduced to me. The lawyer informed my husband, "You're not getting any inheritance, you know?" If the husband had not brought up the subject of an inheritance, the lawyer might have let the matter drop and let it play out. However, when the husband said that he would divorce her if he received her inheritance, the lawyer felt that she should tell him the truth as soon as possible. Just before passing away, my father-in-law had his will altered in the hospital, calling the lawyer to his bedside. My father-in-law did not want to give even the remainder to my husband, and was asking how he could give it to me and my mother-in-law. My husband is a son, so he claims that he has a right to receive the money, and at worst, he is bullish that he should be able to get the remainder of the property. My father-in-law seemed to have anticipated this turn of events, and had made sure that his estate was well organized so that my husband would only get a small portion of the residuary estate even if he filed a claim for infringement of his right to the estate. The compulsory portion is minuscule, and after deducting legal fees, it might even be negative. I wasn't sure about the cost of legal fees, but knowing my father-in-law, he must have arranged it so that my husband would get next to nothing. My husband had been spending lavishly with his mistress, believing he would receive a substantial inheritance, especially after learning he had to leave his job due to illness. He believed that he would get his inheritance more than what he spent. Her husband also worked for a good company, so his salary was reasonable. However, I once pointed out to her that the money she gave him for living expenses was very little considering his income. At the time, he made excuses such as that his salary had dropped due to the recession or that he was no longer receiving bonuses, but it seemed that he was spending all of his money with his unfaithful partner. My father-in-law was an executive at a major company. He retired earlier than retirement age, and I hear that the company rehired him on fairly good terms because of his personality. When my husband and I were dating, I remember him saying that he had never struggled with money in the past. Perhaps that is why he thought he would receive a big amount, maybe even $2 million, as his inheritance. My husband crumpled to his feet and sat down on the floor. My mother-in-law, crying and furious, lamented, "How did our son turn out like this?" blaming herself too. I think that as a child, the parents have a lot of influence, but once you are out in the world, it is up to you. Maybe my husband was a person who was influenced by the people he dated. My husband's arrogance became worse when he started dating the person he was cheating with. Even if his mistress was the root cause, as an adult, my husband was responsible for straying from the right path. John, still in disbelief, kept asking, "How did this happen?" and continued shouting. My mother-in-law and the relatives gave him cold looks and collectively threw him out of the house. "I am the chief mourner. Show some respect." The ceremony can be done even if there are no mourners, because it is obligatory. And the mourners don't have anything to do with it. Crying over something so pointless, I said coldly, laughing off his claim and disregarding his presence. A few weeks later, my husband casually returned to our in-laws' home. I confronted him with divorce papers. He insisted that he should be the one to initiate the divorce, but I explained that if he did, I could drag it out and make it difficult. I thought it would be one resistance or counterattack to stall him for a long time, but that is not the best thing to do now that he has a child. I have to change the current environment quickly for the sake of my son. My husband looks unconvinced that I am taking the initiative, but he himself wants to get a divorce as soon as possible, so he reluctantly agrees with my opinion. But that doesn't mean I want to see my husband anymore. My mother-in-law and I said, "Good luck with your new family." And then we kicked them out of my parents-in-law's house. I had already thrown my husband's belongings out in the corner of the yard. I told them that I would send the rest to their new address, and I completely removed my husband from the house. Later, my husband returned, this time with his mistress. They both seemed oddly triumphant despite his defeated state. His mistress, addressing me with arrogance, said, "You must be bitter about losing your husband. It's the result of neglecting yourself as a woman." She laughed haughtily. And she continued, "I heard all the inheritance goes to my husband, and the divorce is clean-cut." Apparently, my husband hadn't informed her that there was no inheritance. Rubbing her pregnant belly, she boasted that her child would have a better life than my son, who would be left with nothing. Then, a message came through on my phone from my husband. I calmly asked his mistress to hold on while I checked it. My husband was requesting child support for the unborn child, reasoning that it would be unfair to create a disparity between his children. Despite the child being my in-law's grandchild, I wondered how I could love a child born out of an affair during such a difficult time. Ignoring his request for the moment, I decided to reveal something to his mistress that I hadn't told my husband yet. I calmly recited her name, workplace, and family background, information she had no idea I knew. This sent her into a frenzy. She approached me, raising her hand in anger. "Are you gonna hit me? I'll sue you for assault. Everything here is being recorded by the surveillance camera." Pointing at the camera installed in the corner of the room, his mistress timidly withdrew her raised hand. Before he passed away, my father-in-law told me to always keep solid evidence in case I ever had disputes with my husband after his death. That's why, after the funeral, I set up surveillance cameras in the house with the help of relatives. I told my husband that the fact his mistress was his direct subordinate was clearly stated in the documents entrusted to me by my father-in-law. I said I would report to the company that my husband was having an affair with a subordinate. At this point, it didn't matter who seduced whom first. They both consented to the affair, so they were equally at fault. My husband, his face pale, begged me not to report to the company, clinging to my feet. I exclaimed, "Gross," and shook off his grip. Realizing they'd be in trouble if the surveillance footage was used against them, my husband and his mistress left without further resistance. Later, I hired a lawyer, whom I met through my father-in-law, and demanded alimony and child support from my husband. Just when I thought the legal notices would be arriving, I received an enraged call from the mistress. She had gotten my number from my husband's smartphone. She mistakenly thought she could get away with it if she kept silent and was furious about the compensation claim. "You said something different. Why alimony? I should have hit you back then," she ranted. "I never said I'd forgive her. I just mentioned that if she hit me, I'd have evidence to sue her for assault." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. I thought she might be plotting something, but surprisingly, her next words were an apology. She started saying that my lawyer had informed her that my mother-in-law and I would receive the inheritance, and nothing was left for my husband. She apologized for her past behavior and asked if we could share the inheritance with my husband. She suggested settling the alimony and other claims with the inheritance. I argued that an apology wouldn't erase everything and that such matters should be conclusively resolved with tangible consequences. In other words, I rejected the mistress's request. I wouldn't agree to any deal. This led to a huge argument between my husband and the mistress, who were blaming each other, having overheard our conversation. They seemed perfectly matched, both utterly deluded about the real world. I wanted to avoid seeing or hearing my husband as much as possible. I aggressively told him that he'd be in more trouble if we went to court. I mentioned that his direct boss hates dishonesty. Hearing this, my husband agreed to my terms for divorce, alimony, and child support, fearing his boss's reaction. His boss seemed to be a significant threat to him. However, the mistress stubbornly said, "Go ahead, tell my boss. I don't care." So I did, just as she wished. It turned out badly for my ex-husband, but I couldn't help it since he couldn't talk his way out of having an affair. I later found out that my ex-husband's boss was a woman who had been divorced due to her husband's infidelity. Apparently, her ex-husband had an affair with a younger subordinate, just like my ex-husband. After hearing my report, she promised to impose as much punishment as possible. They both ended up being transferred to different locations. My ex-husband reluctantly accepted the transfer, but his affair with the subordinate became known there too, and he eventually had to resign. The mistress protested the transfer, saying it was unfair, but her pleas were ignored. She resigned, complaining, "I can't work there while I have to raise a child." Now unemployed, my ex-husband couldn't cover the child support and alimony with his savings and ended up borrowing money. He could only get loans from dubious lenders, and now he's trapped in debt repayment. My ex-in-laws changed all the locks, making it impossible for him to return to their house. With nowhere to go, my ex-husband moved into the mistress's apartment. But his unemployment continued, leading to eviction due to unpaid rent. He had to turn to the mistress's parents, but things didn't go as he hoped. The mistress, carrying their baby, was reluctantly accepted by her parents. They said the baby wasn't to blame and allowed her to live in their home, but they provided no support for childcare or anything else. I think this was the consequence of destroying my family. However, my ex-husband was thrown out by the mistress's parents for ruining their daughter. He was discarded like trash by them. My ex-husband, now shunned not only by me and my mother-in-law but by the entire family, couldn't return to my ex-in-law's house or rely on relatives. Shunned by my ex-in-laws and the entire family, he couldn't even turn to relatives. His dream of a happy life with a younger woman was just a fantasy. In reality, he was abandoned by both families, lost his job, and had nowhere to go. We hear that the ex-husband is now living in a dingy, shabby apartment with no bathroom and is cutting back on living expenses to pay off the debt he created with his alimony and to pay his monthly child support. He has not been able to find a regular job, and is said to be living part-time for the day. He's struggling to find a steady job and lives day-to-day on odd jobs. Despite everything, the mistress hasn't abandoned him and is working hard, even risking her own well-being, to support a young child and a worthless man. The man I divorced and our son rejected chose a woman who has to work in such a way. I was furious at being cheated on, but now I'm grateful that she took that trash off my hands. Thanks to my father-in-law, I was able to corner my shallow ex-husband thoroughly. Deciding to abandon your child is a tough decision for any parent. Now that I'm a parent myself, I'd do anything for my son. If I were in my father-in-law's shoes, I doubt I could disown my son like he did. All I can do is raise him properly to avoid such a situation. Currently, I'm living modestly with my mother-in-law and son in the house my father-in-law left us. I'm still a novice mom, but I hope to grow alongside my son.